Welcome everyone. A quick note that we are recording and that the recording will be published on our YouTube channel, History at Newcastle. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, wherever you may be located, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and in particular to the Pamalong clan of the Awabakal people of the land on which the Callaghan campus resides, and which is where we in the room are located today. Welcome to the last of our HCCI seminars for 2023. Our speaker today, Bronwen Neal, is Professor of Ancient History in the Department of History and Archaeology at Macquarie University. She has published widely on the history of early Christianity, religious conflict, and Latin and Greek literature of the 4th to 9th centuries. She is a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Humanities and Vice President of the International Association for Patristic Studies. And her paper today is titled Visionary Dreams in the Letters of Julian I, How to Become a Non-Christian Emperor. Bronwen, over to you.
Thanks very much, Sasha and Ryan and Maddie, who's here with us in person, and to you at home or wherever you may be, welcome. I'd just like to acknowledge the Wadawurrung people of the Darug Nation, where Macquarie University is situated and where I did the bulk of this work. So the paper comes out of a project I did on dreams and divination from Baghdad to Byzantium to Baghdad, from 400 to 1000 CE. It was a future fellowship at the funded by the Australian Research Council. So I'm grateful to them. And this is a paper that's a spin-off of that project. But to start, before we get to the incredible dream of Julian about the two trees, I thought I'd just put dream interpretation in context for you. The Greco-Roman practice versus the Judeo-Christian practice, and how somebody like Julian, who was emperor briefly from 361 to 63, and was trying to stop the spread of Christianity actively by resurrecting Greco-Roman religious practices, would perhaps have regarded the interpretation of his own dreams, and to adduce the evidence of letter 14, which he wrote to his physician, who was called Oribasius. And Oribasius was not just a doctor, but he was a friend and advisor to Julian before he became emperor. So this dream occurred 2 years before, or maybe 2.5 before he was raised as emperor of the West. And by then he was sole emperor as well, so East and West. Let's kick off then with an introduction to dream discourses. These have long been used to illuminate and critique competing ideologies in the West, from well before Christianity through the Byzantine and medieval periods. So they still, dream interpretation still exists as a kind of reasonable way to approach trying to determine your own future within various cultures, especially Muslim cultures and former Mediterranean cultures or current Mediterranean cultures. And it's often done in a religious or semi-religious context where you understand that God or Allah sent you the dream for a reason, to tell you something about your future, often in answer to a request. So you might pray before you go to sleep, that you get an answer to a pressing problem in your life. Sometimes they're big questions like, who should I marry? Sometimes they're small ones like, should I set off on my journey tomorrow or the next day? So they're still in use and in daily practice in a lot of cultures, especially Egypt, Greece, some parts of Italy, and some parts of the Balkans. So maybe you have a relative or a grandmother or someone that is accustomed to consulting a dream book, not just for you, but for her own dreams, but also for her relatives. So that's a role that traditionally women played within the context of religious families. The conflicts arising from competing ideologies have been both inter and intra-religious from the introduction of Christianity. So this is not a monolithic culture from the 4th century when Constantine converted, if that's the right word, adopted Christianity as one of his religions in 311, and gradually over that century it became the only legal religion to be practiced right across the Roman Empire. So it took, almost 100 years to get to that point. But of course it didn't mean that traditional practices and other religious practices such as Judaism died overnight. They were still very much alive, if underground. So pagan, I use that word advisedly. Some people avoid using the word pagan altogether, but it here means Greco-Roman, non-Christian, or even pre-Christian, but you have to keep in mind that the pre-Christian practices overlap with the Christian. They didn't stop when Christianity was introduced by Constantine. So pagan and Judeo-Christian traditions of dream divination competed for supremacy in the ongoing effort of Christian leaders from Constantine the Great to claim religious authority. So dreams were one of the ways that people could reinforce their both secular and religious authority. In the Future Fellowship, I sought to highlight the ideological and political investments underlying the scholarly study of dream discourses by Christian sages, both clerical and monastic, from the 4th to 9th century CE in Western Christendom. So that's a fancy way of saying that, especially in the church, wise people such as clergy and monks were trained in the practice of dream divination. It wasn't seen as something magical, but rather something God-given, a source of revelation, to be practiced carefully, cautiously. The practice of divination from dreams, divination means telling the future, was no less a religious practice than a cultural one, having deep roots in the ancient Near East, especially early Judaism, Homeric Greece, and later Platonism. The New Testament offered a new Hellenized approach to dreams and their interpretation. Both strands of practice and thought, the Judaic and the Hellenic or Hellenistic, were taken up in early Christianity. The Judeo-Christian tradition of late antiquity recognised 3 types of dream according to the source of their inspiration. The first was the preoccupations of the mind or the body, and these were the most lowly kind of dreams, the kind of thing you might get caused by eating too much cheese before bed, for instance. That's not advisable if you don't want to have nightmares. The second was Satan and his demons could actively try to kind of thwart Christians by sending them evil dreams or tempting dreams that arouse the passions. And the third source of inspiration through dreams were the highest kind, the divine revelations sent by God, which may be delivered by angels. So people didn't often see God in their dreams, but they did frequently see angels, saints, the prophet, for instance, in early Islam and even modern Islam. So the latter in turn, these divine revelations may be divided into 3 kinds. First, the prophetic or warning dreams, where you get a prophecy or a warning about the future, something to avoid doing if you don't want a bad outcome. The second was recurring dreams, which perhaps allow the dreamer to run through a problem that the mind is trying to solve. So they recognised, as we do in modern psychology, that dreams are the brain processing recent and past events. And finally, lucid dreams, which we might call visions, which ancient people did call visions. Lucid dreams are those that are the most memorable. We use the word in a different context in modern psychology. Lucid dreams are said to be where you're kind of half awake while you're dreaming, and if someone speaks to you and gives you an instruction, you can actually follow it while not waking up. So there's been lots of psychological tests where they see if people can like wiggle their left finger while they're asleep. If they can be told to do it and do it, then they're said to be capable of lucid dreaming. It's a bit of a blunt instrument as a test, but anyway, that's not what the ancient world meant by lucid dreams. They meant visions, things that were very clear. And perhaps you've had one yourself. I must say that I feel that I've had some dreams that stand out as being particularly meaningful and useful to your waking life. So lucid dreams are something that is really the category that I would put this stream of Julian's into. It appears that in the secular realm of dream key manuals, which were dictionaries of dream symbols plus their meanings, Greeks and Romans from the pre-Christian tradition were exemplified by Artemidorus' Oneirocriticon, which is like a critical manual of dreams from the 2nd century. They're also exemplified in Byzantine Christian literature. There were a number of Byzantine dream books attributed to the Hebrew prophet Daniel, to the Emperor Nicephorus, and to others. And early medieval Latins, such as the author or translator of the Somnia Danielis, the Dreams of Daniel. So they refer back to the Old Testament for the prophet Daniel as a kind of author of a dream book that was still in use from the 7th century up to the 17th. So all these three sources viewed dreams in a remarkably similar way as a series of symbols with definitive meanings within a semiotic range, a range of meanings that apply to everyday activities such as commerce, travel, and family relations. The earliest extant dream key manual is that one from Artemidorus of Daldis in Asia Minor, that's the west coast of modern Turkey. In this Oneirocriticon, each symbol in the dream is given its own range of possible meanings, some of them contradictory. There was no goal of internal consistency, so you needed interpretation. They gave the ordinary dreamer, as long as he or she could read, the power to take the interpretation of dreams into their own hands. They were inherently amoral, so I wouldn't say immoral, but there's nothing moral about them. And they thus transcend normal religious strictures and boundaries. Christine Wilder reminds us that in the cultural milieu of the Roman Mediterranean of Artemidorus era, which is the 2nd century, dreams fulfilled an important cultural role of regulating anxieties. These anxieties could be caused by different kinds of crisis. They were used to diagnose illness, to predict the future, and to determine one's place and destiny in a universe governed by capricious gods. They were also obsessed with status, one's social rank relative to other people, and thus there were different interpretations for the rich and the poor, for freedmen and for slaves. Many symbols relate to a sudden change of circumstance or loss of wealth, or the opposite, suddenly coming into wealth. For instance, dreaming of a prostitute meant a good outcome in business. So you can see what I meant about being amoral. Divine revelation in dreams sits very well with a sense of divine election or predestination, being chosen by God for a kind of higher purpose. In the Judeo-Christian and Islamic traditions from their origins today, God is believed to have delivered dreams of warning and revelation to the virtuous. Dreams are considered potential tools of providence, alongside scripture and prayer, based on an understanding of God's intervention in personal histories. This was not necessarily a positive trend, rather the prevalence of such discourse in Julian's letters witnesses to an ongoing process of cultural fragmentation in the later Roman Empire. This was due partly to ongoing war with the Sasanians in the 360s, and partly due to the struggles between the sons of Constantine to become sole heirs to the newly Christian Roman Empire. Laws dating from the 350s prescribed the death penalty for those who performed or attended pagan sacrifices for the worshipping of idols, which were statues of the Roman and Greek gods. Temples were shut down and the altar of victory was removed from the Senate meeting house in Rome. There were also frequent episodes of ordinary Christians destroying, pillaging, and desecrating many ancient Roman temples, tombs, and monuments, even though their rites were still popular among the population at the time, the general population. The emperor's policies were passively resisted by many governors and magistrates. So we can see the 350s when Julian was first starting to agitate to be taken seriously as an heir to Constantine against the three sons of Constantine, two of whom died quite quickly in this struggle, and then the last one was still alive until 361. And as soon as he died, Julian became emperor. So it was a turbulent time in the Roman Empire. So this paper, freezes sometimes when you don't pay attention for a few minutes. Yeah, thank you. This paper looks at the ancient Greco-Roman practice of divination, which I've just explained, and the application of this process to dreams under the Caesar and later Emperor Julian, an avowed enemy of the Galileans or Christians. He called them Galileans. He was Caesar from 355. Following anthropologist Anthony Wallace, I read narrated dreams and visions as symptoms of a cultural fragmentation and as indicative of an attempt to revitalise Christian or pagan religious cultures, and I quote from Wallace, by reinterpreting its myths, rituals and symbols, which are deeply embedded in individuals. So the idea of Wallace is that dreams can facilitate mazeway reformulation. So the mazeways are the kind of parts in the brain that automatically see things in terms of their own cultures, myths, symbols, and rituals. They're deeply embedded, but you can use things like dreams to related dreams or narrated dreams. Okay, so they don't really have much impact if you don't tell them to anyone, to facilitate mazeway reformulation for other people on a wide scale. Although the Greco-Roman tradition of dream interpretation could be used to shore up fragmentation within groups of shared Christian identity, it was also used to support divine appointment by others, like the Neoplatonist Julian and his physician Oribasius, who regarded it as a tool of providence and divine revelation. So they tend to talk about providence rather than God, given that they're Platonists, and for the Platonists there were lots of gods, but the gods were really symbols of virtues or vices, and the higher gods were the ones that represented the good for Plato. So you can see that small move from the good to God was really taking shape in this 4th century period. My evidence is drawn mostly from Julian's early letters, so before he became emperor in 361, and especially letter 14. The crisis was caused by Julian's challenge to the rule of Constantius II, by then Constantine's only surviving son. When Julian wrote to Oribasius, the Emperor Constantius, pictured here in the silver missorium of Kirsch. So missorium is a plate used for the mass for the host, and Kirsch is in Germany, I think, somewhere around there. The Emperor Constantius in this, he was busy reinterpreting cultural symbols in his own way, and on this plate he's depicted as a soldier on horseback, preceded by victory. So victory's on the right there with a tambourine, and that's particularly Judeo-Roman kind of depiction of a conquering king. But you can see a lot of Greek elements as well in the dress and in the fact that he's riding a horse and in the fact that he's kind of front on, and the halo is indicates that he's Christian. So it should be remembered that Constantius, he was a semi-Arian. He wasn't what we would call an Orthodox Christian. According to Constantine, at least, he believed in it, that Jesus was not exactly equal to God, but was a bit of a second-rate God. So he was still operating in the Roman model there, where you had one kind of head god like Zeus or Jupiter, and then you'd have sons and daughters of that god, and then they had their sons and daughters, and they interbred with humans, and you had semi-gods. So he was of the belief that, I'm oversimplifying obviously, if you happen to be an Arian, don't get upset with me. It was condemned, though, I must point out, at several councils in the 3rd and 4th centuries already, the 4th and 5th. So Constantine was a semi-Arian, and he had no particular success in trying to shut down paganism, with his laws prescribing the death penalty for those who performed or watched sacrifices in the temples, the Greco-Roman temples. Some temples were shut down, as we mentioned, but Constantius kept the role of Pontifex Maximus for himself, and this is something that Ryan has been working on. The emperor's assuming or continuing to assume the Roman title of Pontifex Maximus, which just means the head priest, the greatest priest, the chief priest. And Constantius, like Constantine, was deified after he died. So that was not a particularly Christian thing to do, you might think, from the modern perspective, but all the Christian emperors in this period aspired to be deified, just like his father, Constantine I. He didn't disband priestly colleges and even ordered the election of a priest for Africa. So he's still perpetuating the Greco-Roman cult. The Roman calendar of 354 is evidence that many pagan festivals were still being openly observed, or at the very least remembered by some officials in the 350s. Ammianus recorded the worship of the traditional gods. This is Ammianus Marcellinus, who was a mid-4th century Roman historian and very much not a Christian. So he recorded the worship of the traditional gods with sacrifices as occurring in Rome and Alexandria in his day, as did Firmicius Maternus and other historiographers. So it's still very much a contested space, we could say. The context of war was an important factor in attempts to produce a unified religious culture. As De Maio and Frakes note, and I quote, the war against the Sasanians, who were the Persians, which had been in a lull since 350, erupted with renewed intensity in 359, just when this letter was written, and Constantius travelled to the east in 360 to restore stability after the loss of several border fortresses, end of quote. However, Julian claimed the rank of Augustus in 360, leading to the war between the two after Constantius' attempts to persuade Julian to back down failed. No battle was fought, as Constantius became ill and died of fever on the 3rd of November 361, allegedly naming Julian as his rightful successor before his death. Unfortunately, nobody heard that except Julian. So that's when he became emperor, in November 361. So Julian's 14th letter, the one to Oribasius, starts by acknowledging a divinatory dream had by his physician, and reports one that he'd just had. The letter was written in 358 or 59 based on its mention of the recall of Julian's advisor Sallust, and is addressed to Oribasius while the latter was in Vienne and Julian himself was in Paris. It was a time of great uncertainty for Julian, only a year or two before he was proclaimed Augustus in early 360, engaging Constantius II in a conflict that lasted until Constantius' untimely death. The young Caesar was fresh from his studies of Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, and Maximus of Tyre, undertaken in Athens and then Pergamum, but he had not yet embarked on any religious program of his own at the point that he wrote this letter. However, we can see the seeds of change in this letter. He starts with an appeal to Homer, common knowledge for any educated Greek, and uses the stranger Hermes as his guide in interpreting his dream of two trees, the same god that was to be his guide in the seventh oration. This oration from 362, so 3 years later, was addressed to Heraclius the Cynic, a philosopher, and presented Julian as the infant son of Helios and Athena. So that's the way he was thinking of himself, as the offspring of the sun god and Athena, the goddess of war. Hermes promised to lead him safely along the path that had killed his half-brothers, the heirs of Constantine. So you can see how he's reframing and using Greek myth to reframe his journey to power in 362, by which time he is already emperor. But in this letter, he's still struggling to build his power base, and he's using dreams as an indication that he is divinely appointed. So he starts by saying, the divinely inspired Homer says that there are two gates of dreams, and you'll know this if you've studied Homer, and that with regard to future events, we cannot trust them both equally. But I think that this time, if ever before, you have seen clearly into the future, for I too this very day saw a vision of the same sort. So he's not saying that he's dreaming at night. This was a vision. It's a bit vague, the phrase very day, but I just want to mention that visions can be seen in the day or the night, doesn't matter. This is the translation of Wright, by the way, from 1923. In the Lur. For fleeting dreams have two gates. One of them is fashioned of horn and one of ivory. This is the quote from the Odyssey 19. Those which pass through the one of sawn ivory are deceptive, bringing tidings which come to nothing. But those which issue from the ones of polished horn bring true results when a mortal sees them. So this is the way that mortals can kind of see into the future like gods can. And he doesn't kind of spell out what the two types of dreams are in the quote in the first paragraph there. He just assumes that you'll know, because Oribasius would definitely have read Homer and he knew that. So his description of his vision is this: I thought that in a certain very spacious room a tall tree had been planted, and that it was leaning down to the ground, while at its root had sprouted another small and young and very flourishing tree. And now I was very anxious on behalf of the small tree, lest someone in pulling up the large one should pull it up as well. So you're getting where this is going, right? He's the little tree, and the big tree is his previous Constantinian relatives who've crashed to the ground. They've all died in various unpleasant ways. And in fact, when I came close, I saw that the tall tree was lying at full length on the ground, but the small one was still upright, but hung suspended away from the earth. And now when I saw this, I said in great anxiety, alas for this tall tree, there is danger that not even its offspring will be preserved, this little tree. And then one who was altogether a stranger to me, this is Hermes, said, look carefully and take courage. This is the interpretation. For since the root still remains in the earth, the smaller tree will be uninjured and will be established even more securely than before. So much then for my dreams. God knows what they portend. So he doesn't actually make an interpretation here. And that's interesting because this is before Constantius II had died. So you're not actually allowed to predict the death of an emperor. It's treasonous. You can be killed, executed for it. So he has to say God knows what they portend, and even to say God there is a bit Christianized. So that's the translation of Wright. He would have said the gods know what this portends. So my suggestion is not only that he's using Greek sources, but that he's also aware of the Old Testament because he was brought up a Christian as the heir of potential heir, fourth heir of Constantine. And there's a very similar Eastern understanding of trees as meaning kingly power. And we see this in the interpretation of the dream of, is it Belteshazzar? Belteshazzar is Daniel's other name, who has been asked to interpret this dream for, is it Cyrus? Nebuchadnezzar, thank you very much. For Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Babylonians, who is about to lose his power. So the king said to Daniel, Belteshazzar, let not the dream or interpretation alarm you. And Daniel said, I am worried. I'm worried for you. My lord, may the dream be for those who hate you and its interpretation for your enemies. So that's a way of kind of defang the power of this dream. You say, I really hope this dream doesn't apply to you. I hope it applies to those who are trying to bring you down. The tree you saw, which grew and became strong so that its top reached to heaven, and it was visible to the end of the whole earth. So this is the Babylonian Empire, whose leaves were beautiful and its fruit abundant, and which was food for all, under which beasts of the field found shade, and in whose branches the birds of heaven lived. It is you, O King, who have grown and become strong. Your greatness has grown and reaches to heaven, and your dominion to the ends of the earth. So that's all well and good until the tree falls over, right? Which is the rest of his interpretation. We don't have any more, or is it just stuck again? Thank you. So here's the rest of it. And because the king saw a watcher, a holy one, in his dream that is, saying, coming down from heaven and saying, chop down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump of its roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze, in the tender grass of the field, and let him be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beasts of the field till 7 periods of time pass over him. This is the interpretation, O king. It is a degree of the Most High which has come upon my lord the king, that you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. You'll be made to eat grass like an ox, and you'll be wet with the dew of heaven, and 7 periods of time shall pass over you, till you know that the Most High rules the kingdoms on earth, and gives them to anyone he wishes. So this is predicting the demise of Nebuchadnezzar, which obviously did come to pass. And you'll see that very interesting similarity with the dream that we read of, or the vision of Julian, and the concern about the roots leaving the stump in the earth, because otherwise your reign will be over. So Nebuchadnezzar did have a son who went on to rule for a little while, but then the whole empire collapsed. So I'm just putting that out there for your edification. I think it's highly likely that he knew scriptures, maybe not all of them, but Daniel was obviously one that was very well read in late antiquity, because we have this dream book of Daniel that popped up in Latin or Greek and then was translated into the other. It's a little hard to tell which one was original. But certainly the Somnia Danialis lasted for a long time. So if you were in this realm where dreams had cultural significance, and images like huge trees being felled were part of the Roman psyche as being symbolic of leadership, which was somewhat tenuous, I think this was a really clever way of Julian getting his message out there that he was on the up and up. The fact that he wrote this letter to his physician is not strange, because physicians were the ones that would tell you dreams for you often, especially in an imperial context. You would have somebody that was dedicated to reading symbols for that pertain to your future. But at the same time, he's only Augustus at this point, or even Caesar, and so he can't come out and say, this is my plan. He would have known that the letters were going to be kept for posterity, because that was a normal practice. Unfortunately, we don't have any imperial collections of letters. We've got the odd one from Constantine and from Constantius, but they're of limited use because they're not kind of put together in a big collection with about 100 letters like Julian. So it's a very special collection. It's unique. Also in that it documents some of his life before he became emperor. He was only emperor for 18 months, actually. So he didn't last very long. He died in war against the Persians, and who knows, did he have a dream depicting his own demise? Not one that was kept. So this dream symbolism is also witnessed from much later periods, like Michael Zelos, who was an orator for the court of the Byzantine emperors and died in 1078, who at his mother's funeral oration, which he took as an opportunity to talk about himself, recounted a vision she received when he was young, where he appeared as a golden vine towering above her. She took this as a guarantee of his future greatness as an orator, and indeed he did become advisor in the court of 3 Byzantine emperors. I should also mention that the dream symbol was used not only in Homer but in other Greek sources, classical Greek sources such as Sophocles' Electra. Clytemnestra dreamt of a flourishing limb in that play, a symbol of the restoration of Mycenaean power under her husband Agamemnon. So it was there not only in the Near East but also in the archaic Greek period. So Julian would have had several examples to draw upon. If he didn't draw upon that of Nebuchadnezzar, he could have drawn on that of Sophocles. So, to conclude, I've suggested that the discourse around dreams and visions that Julian participated in before he was proclaimed emperor in 361 was a symptom of cultural fragmentation and is indicative of an attempt to revitalise religious culture by reinterpreting its myths and symbols from the past for a present that was characterised by chaos and conflict. The practice of dream interpretation offered Julian an opportunity to shape his own destiny in the context of social and cultural disruption before the death of Constantius, and this practice was to become more common in the era after his demise. He was the last avowedly non-Christian emperor, by the way. It would have been little comfort to Christians to know that Julian had been singled out for greatness in a dream. The discourse of personal revelation increased the sense of power of the individual, but alienated those who fell outside the scope of revelation. So in that case of Julian, all of Christianity was outside the scope of his revelation. In this way, a discourse that aimed towards social cohesion instead caused more cultural fragmentation and religious conflict. So we can say it wasn't a successful strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Bronwen. That was absolutely fascinating paper. I'll just stop the screen share if that's okay, so that absolutely fascinating paper, and I would like to invite questions. I might take shameless advantage of my position as chair and leap in with the first question. You addressed it towards the end there about the collection of these letters of emperors. So I'm wondering how this particular collection of letters came down to us, and if they were available to scholars in the in the medieval period, how Christian scholars interpreted this dream.
Yes, so they seem to have decided that silence was the best policy,
Right.
and no one comments on it. Although we know they were reading it because the collections are, as you say, medieval. They were being copied in the Middle Ages. They were perhaps being copied as literary exercises for the teaching of Hellenistic culture. You know, there's a big rise of Byzantine humanism from about the 12th century. Around the same time as the West was having their Renaissance. They were under Michael Sellos, actually, so that's the end of the 11th. They started copying ancient Greek sources, and they would have treated Julian in the same category as not something to copy in your life, but as a kind of cultural heritage. Yeah, but they don't comment on it. So I've never read an article on this dream. People do comment on his being said to be interested in dreams in Marcellinus, and Marcellinus doesn't. He seems to think this is a good practice, but that's contemporary. That's 4th century, or just after he died. So yeah, there's no Christian outcry about this, and for me, that kind of reinforces the theory that this was a common cultural discourse. They couldn't actually dispute that he'd had a dream that might have had some meaning. If they'd had to say anything about it, they would have said, I imagine that it came from Satan or his demons. And you know, it was tempting him with power in the same way that Jesus was tempted by Satan to kind of give over to him in his vision in the desert. Do you know about that, by the way? That's a fantastic episode in Jesus' life where he gets he goes off in self-exile in the desert for 40 days and he gets tempted 3 times by Satan. And one of them is this vision that if he bows down and worships the devil, everything that he can see from his high point in the desert, which is all of Judea, will be under his control, Jesus' control. Obviously, he said thanks, but no thanks. But it does show, and maybe I should mention that actually, that the Judeo-Christian treatment of visions and power was equally as strong as the Hellenistic in this period.
Fascinating.
Good question.
Right.
So this is written before his ascent, correct? So while Constantius is still in power, so theoretically he's probably still a crypto-pagan, right? He's still pretending to be a Christian because he doesn't really seem to reveal himself until his full grasp of power, I think, if I recall. So
yeah, I find that a bit questionable, actually. That is the general consensus, but the early letters are very clear that, so he hasn't written these against the Galileans. That comes later when he's in power.
So I'm wondering if, maybe he's obscuring his, by reference to, God only knows rather than the gods. Maybe he's being a bit obscure or referring to the stranger, this sort of obscure figure rather than
It's
Hermes. He might still be,
a good point, actually.
because presumably, he'd have to hide his motives until he actually gains power, because it'd be very unpopular probably to reveal his true feelings.
I think there might be something in that. And it's certainly the reference to Hermes is very elliptical.
Right.
And it's not till he becomes emperor that he's starting to present himself as the son of Athena and Helios, as I mentioned. So yeah, that is something I might have to have a look at. So letters they're difficult because these early letters are all about Neoplatonist philosophy, right? So it's not religion per se.
Right. And there's some compatibility with Christian ideas, so you can kind of,
you can fudge it a bit, exactly, hold your cards close to your chest. But yeah, certainly he hasn't come out as an anti-Christian outside his own circle of friends.
And the other thing I wanted to note, right, despite his hatred for the Christians, he seems to really love the Jews, right? He's patronizes them. So I mean, presumably, maybe he has he favors the Danielic literature. Maybe he's actually
that's true.
He wouldn't have necessarily been opposed to that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, how much he really favoured them and how much he really just wanted to annoy the Christians
Right.
is a little bit of a moot point. But and you could say that Daniel belongs to the Christians as much as to the Jews by this time. But yeah, certainly that would have hit a chord with any Jewish readers. Good point. Thank you.
Other questions?
But I'm still trying to formulate how to say them. How old was Julian when he wrote this letter?
I forget when he was born. Let me have a look. It's somewhere in my notes. I think around 30.
Okay.
You looking it up?
Yeah. Our search is
Having Ryan here so handy. Nebuchadnezzar.
I should know this myself, but
Yeah.
so I'm showing my cards.
So go on, let's say around 30.
Alright, beautiful. I was just wondering because we're talking about how he was potentially hiding this anti-Christian kind of and whether it had to do more with whether he was just trying to figure out where he actually sat within religion. If he was a bit younger, you might still be trying to grapple with his own religious identity. But if he's 30, then he's probably had all of the education and
And all the education he's going to have,
Yeah. It's probably quite solid in his ideas by this point. The other thing I was going to ask is, so was it quite common to kind of make up dreams or to use dreams for political agenda?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, but it's kind of hard to identify when they're made up because we only know them in the third person account. Yeah, but it was, there's so many of them that you have to think that several of them must have been.
Yeah.
Because it's such a useful tool, right? No one can discredit it and say, no, you didn't dream that. And it's quite dangerous to say, well, even if you dreamt that, that was just a figment of your imagination. That wasn't the divine speaking to you, because who can really say?
Yeah, I'm just imagining like, oh, I've had this divine prophecy where I become a millionaire, and if it doesn't happen, well then, oh, that mustn't have been divine prophecy, and how often that kind of occurred. Yeah.
Self-belief bordering on mania. Yeah. So it's still used in kind of political rhetoric in the Middle East. For instance, Saddam Hussein had a dream just before the first Gulf War that the big guns in Kuwait were pointing the wrong way. So that was interpreted on the eve of war in various ways. So it's something that they still use in politics in some parts of the world, but not in our own, because we've had the Enlightenment and we reckon that dreams don't have any value now, but they still do have this covert cultural value. That's what I was trying to uncover. And people might not admit it, but lots of, I imagine that, because people don't admit it, but I imagine that there's a lot of world leaders that have had dreams of divine mandate, right? Because it'd be on your mind if you were working your way. I'd like to ask Boris Johnson, for instance, whether he had such a dream and whether he had another one that predicted his demise. But obviously that's, your demise is the other side of this coin. You're always afraid that you're going to lose power. So there's a great story about Athanasius, the Emperor Athanasius at the end of the 5th century, dreaming that a wild boar was rushing him and about to bore him and kill him. And he related it to his in-court dream interpreter, and that guy said, oh yeah, I had that dream about you as well.
Don't want to say anything.
I didn't want to say anything. You don't want to make yourself unpopular with the emperor. So you can really feel like Daniel in that Nebuchadnezzar story is like, he's totally, his life is in the hands of this foreign king, and he's been brought in as a Jew, and so he's in a very tenuous position as one of the subject people, but he tries to kind of divert attention away from the bad message by saying, I really hope this dream wasn't for you. I hope it was for your enemies. So I find it very entertaining, I must say. I reckon it's something that most historical scholars skip over, like not so much scholars of Homer, but scholars of history. But once you start opening your eyes for dreams in histories, they are everywhere, up until late antiquity. For sure, I would say even maybe a bit less so in the East, in Byzantium in the medieval period. We just don't have that many sources actually from the East, but they're there in the novels, the Byzantine novels from the medieval period. So they are a bit more common in certain genre than others, but in this period in late antiquity, they're still there in the histories, the official court history. So they are great.
Thanks so much.
Fascinating. Can I ask a couple of questions about the broader context, or the broader religious context? I'm struck by, I mean, I get the logic of why Daniel would have conveniently written how-to manuals for interpreting dreams, or at least be a very useful person rather to attribute your
Exactly right.
new and exciting manuscript for interpreting dreams
Yeah.
too. But the other figure that seems logical to attribute these texts to would have been Joseph, thinking of the dream interpretation. Are there also texts attributed to him, or does Daniel somehow get the credits?
Daniel gets all the credit. Joseph is problematic because wasn't a good person, right? He wasn't particularly virtuous at the time that he had this gift for dream interpretation. So it's very, very early in the Judaic story. But mainly he used these dreams to tell his brothers that he was better than they were. So that's seen as a kind of sin of vainglory, and that could be part of the reason I think that Joseph wasn't attributed a dream book. But the book of Daniel was written in the 2nd century BC only, so although it's referring to events in the 6th BC, it's really a lot later than that. So it makes more sense that it was picked up perhaps by, the dream book of Daniel resembles the dream book of Artemidorus. Yeah, so it's not actually based on the Jewish tradition so much as the Greco-Roman.
Right, with the serial serial numbers filed off and lightly related. Right, got it.
Exactly right, yeah.
And the other question I was wondering about is the idea that in the Greco-Roman tradition, the gods have the ability to see into the future. And the reason this sort of struck me is I have a PhD student currently who's working on the practice of sacrifice in the Norse mythology, and an awful lot of the time what they're doing is they're sacrificing themselves even in order to gain visions of the future and the sort of knowledge that this special knowledge, which frankly sounds to me like a lot of work. Do the Greco-Roman gods have it easier? Is this something they have on tap, or?
No, they're not going to lose an eye in order to get divine sight.
Right.
No, it's something they seem not to have to earn.
Right.
But they can also be duplicitous. So there's the story of Athena in Homer coming down and telling the Trojans that they're going to win the war. Yeah.
Right,
And,
okay.
Yeah, didn't work out that way. And so you couldn't actually trust a Greek god, even in Homer's time.
Huh, fascinating.
I know, even in a dream. Whereas in the Christian tradition, they were more reliable. Now, Artemidorus isn't talking about saints, obviously, 2nd centuries. He's Greek, he's not talking about gods either. He's talking about everyday things like frogs, rivers, accidents, just more mundane. Yeah. But they can have big meanings like success in business or death of your wife, or things that are big in a personal life, but they're not really big in a cultural way. But then a dream for a king means more than a dream for an ordinary person. A dream for a slave doesn't mean, isn't to be taken seriously in the same way as a dream of a rich person.
I'm fascinated that we know anything about the dreams of slaves.
Only Artemidorus, and then from the Somnia Danielis onwards, it was part of the context of interpreting. So there's the list of symbols, which is in 2 books of Artemidorus, and then the other 3, and the other 2 are the theory of how to interpret, how to take the context into account, which includes the climate, the season, the job the dreamer does, their profession, their place in the family, their health, whether they're free or not, or that kind of thing. So it was a science, it was treated as a science.
Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And must be hugely rich for cultural historians trying to understand the social structure of
Yeah, absolutely.
the period was.
So the status anxiety comes out very clearly in dreams about animals.
Mhm.
If you see a kind of low animal like a slug or anything that's low to the ground, kind of getting near you or infesting you or attacking you in some way, then that's a symbol that you're going down. But if you've got a lion coming after you, if you manage to vanquish the lion, then that's good, you're on the way up. If the lion kills you or harms you, then that's a powerful person that's going to do you down.
Right.
So yeah, lots of status anxiety. That's pretty predictable, but the kind of middle range symbols aren't predictable at all. Like who knows which way a frog's going to go unless you have the manual
Right.
with you.
Okay.
Or if you can't read, you've got somebody you can pay to interpret for you. So it was a thriving trading dream interpretation from the second century.
Just have to ask that, like, do you pay for it?
Yeah.
That would make sense as to also why your dream status might be different depending on how much you can pay, I would think.
Yeah, well, you're more liable to get a good reading if you can pay more.
Yeah.
So I only go to the good psychics. It's worth the money.
It's worth the investment. The Christians, so there was rabbis that would interpret and they didn't do it for money in the Talmudic period, so from the 2nd to the 6th century, and then the Christians had an ambivalent attitude and generally they said you shouldn't take money. So in the Shepherd of Hermes, he says, you can tell the difference between a secular or a Greek dream interpreter and a Christian one because he's the one sitting by himself over there waiting for someone that can pay him before he'll give a reading of your dream, whereas the Christian ones have, got crowds of people around them because they do it for free.
And I'm sorry, this is getting further away from your original topic, but it's a fascinating question. I know that in the period of the Enlightenment, in the Habsburg Empire, Lutheran and Calvinist priests would refuse to give you holy water or divine charms or things like that in order to heal you, because they felt, we're in the Enlightenment now, go and see a doctor for goodness sakes. But so there are examples or reports of Lutheran peasants in places like Transylvania going to an Orthodox priest because an Orthodox priest would still happily give you these things. And indeed, I've witnessed an Orthodox priest doing this in the 21st century, along with saying, and also go and see your doctor, right?
Yeah.
But let's get you both the options. So do you see? Is there evidence of people going across religious divides because they feel they're going to get a better dream interpretation from this person or something like that?
They maybe not to get a better one, but they didn't care about the kind of religious affiliation of the saint. If, for instance, fertility shrines, they're more interested in the outcome. So you could go to a Christian shrine that had become Muslim. And as Christians still go there because you had heard stories that it worked and you wanted to be made fertile. So not that they shopped around, but they kind of saw it as something that transcended religion.
Right.
So Christians would go and see oracles. For instance, in Delphi, John Chrysostom was very exercised about Christians still going to see oracles. He wanted to destroy them, whereas Julian wanted to revive them. Yeah.
I mean, John Chrysostom's standard register seems to be infuriating anyway, but no, absolutely. Okay, I'm sorry, I have now been monopolising the question shamelessly, and I should stop. Are there any other questions, or?
There's none in chat that I can see.
Alrighty, so we might draw things to a close and move on to the exciting thing of coffee, which is a very important part of these proceedings. So please join me in thanking Bronwen again for an absolutely fascinating paper. That's it for us for 2023, but we will be back in 2024 with another fantastic lineup, and we hope